In the early months of 1942, as the Pacific lay shrouded under the expanding shadow of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an unusual silence settled beneath the waves, a silence belonging to the U.S. Navy's growing force of submarines. Few outside the Navy's highest circles knew that these boats were not only hunting enemy shipping, but also conducting some of the most sensitive reconnaissance missions of the early war. Among them was the USS Gudgeon, a Tambor-class submarine operating far beyond what official wartime communiques ever acknowledged. Her patrols, and those of her sister boats, would become the foundation of a classified effort to map, observe and report on Japanese operations in places where aircraft could not fly and surface ships could not survive. The struggle these crews faced began long before they reached enemy waters. U.S. submarines in early 1942 were equipped with unreliable torpedoes, untested radar systems, and incomplete intelligence about Japanese patrol patterns. Orders such as the January 20, 1942 directive to Gudgeon, to infiltrate the approaches to the Japanese home waters and observe traffic near Okinawa, pushed the boundaries of what submarine warfare had ever attempted. The men who sailed aboard these boats were volunteers who understood the risks: depth charge attacks, mechanical failures, and the constant possibility that a single mistake could trap them on the seabed with no hope of rescue. But in those desperate early weeks after Pearl Harbor, intelligence was more valuable than steel, and the Navy's Silent Service was tasked with delivering it. A diary entry from Lieutenant Commander Elton Joe Grenfell, Gudgeon's commanding officer, captured the mix of uncertainty and determination. "We go forward with little guidance. The seas ahead are enemy seas, charted by the Japanese and by no one else. If we return, what we bring back may shape the course of this war." He was not exaggerating. The Gudgeon's first patrol required threading through narrow straits, slipping beneath fishing fleets packed with radio-equipped trawlers, and remaining motionless for hours as Japanese destroyers swept the area. Her mission logs, later partially declassified, describe long stretches spent at 300 feet or deeper, conserving battery power and oxygen while waiting for the right moment to surface and report. The true purpose of these patrols often extended beyond the standard kill mission narrative. The Gudgeon and other early war submarines were assigned to chart the movement of Japanese fleet units, information that American naval planners desperately needed after the crippling loss of battleships at Pearl Harbor. Signal intercepts alone could not confirm where the Japanese were massing aircraft carriers, cruisers, or troop convoys. Submarines, hidden in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, became the eyes of a fleet that was still rebuilding. Yet many of their findings were so sensitive that after being radioed to Pearl Harbor, they were immediately routed into classified archives and never mentioned again in official histories. Some of the most intriguing details came from later released fragments of Japanese records that mentioned submarine sightings in areas where no U.S. boats were officially present. One such document from a coastal defense unit in the Marianas reported a submerged contact on March 14, 1942, describing it as likely American. No U.S. submarine patrol report for that period places a boat in that area. The discrepancy continues to puzzle historians. Was the Navy running operations still not disclosed today? Or were boats like Gudgeon following alternate routes ordered only verbally by higher command? These missions yielded intelligence that directly influenced future operations. Submarines reported shipping concentrations around the Bonin Islands, tracked destroyer groups refueling north of Saipan, and monitored mine-laying activities in waters that American war planners hoped to exploit later in the campaign. The modern lesson is clear: good intelligence is never accidental. It is earned, often in total darkness, in cramped steel compartments, by crews whose work the world may never know. But the deepest mystery of these early clandestine patrols remains the question of what was not reported. Several patrol logs from 1942 contain abrupt gaps, missing pages, redacted sections, or sudden shifts in location with no explanation. Historians have long debated whether these omissions were routine wartime censorship or evidence of operations still too sensitive to be revealed. The Gudgeon herself would vanish 2 years later, lost with all hands somewhere in the Western Pacific, leaving behind one final riddle: what missions she carried out that remained sealed, and what information lies forever on the ocean floor with her. As 1942 progressed, the U.S. Navy realized that submarines were more than strike weapons. They were instruments of intelligence gathering, infiltration, and covert action. And those early reconnaissance patrols, dangerous and often uncredited, would pave the way for even riskier missions to come. Missions where submarines carried not just crews, but spies, saboteurs, and operatives whose presence beneath the Pacific remains a quiet but critical chapter of the war. The next stage of these secret operations would take the Silent Service from observation to direct involvement, inserting Allied agents into territories where survival was rarely guaranteed. In the vast, silent expanse of the North African desert, few people today remember that the Special Air Service, now one of the world's most elite military units, was born not with triumph, but with uncertainty and improvisation. In late 1941, when the British 8th Army struggled against Rommel's Afrika Korps, a small group of men under an unproven young officer named David Stirling prepared to attempt something unprecedented: deep penetration raids into Axis-controlled territory, far beyond the reach of conventional forces. What followed would define the DNA of the SAS, yet many of these early missions remain overshadowed by their later legendary operations. The struggle began in Cairo, where Stirling, still on crutches after a parachuting accident, convinced Middle East headquarters to authorize what was essentially an experiment. His idea was simple but dangerous: insert small, highly trained teams by parachute at night, strike enemy airfields, and disappear into the desert before Axis forces could respond. The challenge, however, was immense. The North African desert was not merely a battlefield. It was a natural barrier of shifting dunes, sudden storms, and temperatures that could kill a man quicker than enemy fire. Navigation beyond the coast road required instinct and luck. Even veteran desert soldiers feared becoming lost in the endless wastes. On the night of November 16, 1941, Stirling's new unit, then barely 60 men strong and officially called AL Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, launched their first major operation in conjunction with Operation Crusader. Their targets were Axis airfields at Gazala and Tmimi in Cyrenaica. But almost immediately the desert turned against them. A fierce Khamsin wind tore across the landing zones, scattering parachutists over miles. Men landed far from their intended drop points, equipment was damaged, and several soldiers were injured upon landing. Many could not find their teams in the storm. As dawn neared, Stirling made the difficult decision to withdraw the survivors. Despite the setback, some patrols pushed on. One group led by Lieutenant Jacques Louis, the brilliant and disciplined officer who designed much of the SAS demolition kit, trekked through the night toward the Tmimi airfield. Their challenges were maddeningly physical, marching through loose sand, conserving water, and avoiding German reconnaissance vehicles. In his diary, Louis wrote, "The desert watches every step. One mistake and it takes you." His words captured the constant tension of these early missions. Every movement was a negotiation with the elements as much as with the enemy. When Louis's team finally reached Tmimi, they found the airfield unexpectedly active. Luftwaffe mechanics worked under floodlights, preparing Stuka dive bombers for dawn operations. The patrol had only minutes. Moving low through the shadows, they planted Louis bombs beneath fuel tanks and aircraft. The charges were timed, giving the team just enough time to crawl back into the night. Moments later, explosions ripped through the field, sending pillars of fire into the desert sky. Aircraft erupted in flames, ammunition cooked off, and Axis personnel scrambled in panic. But the return journey was another battle entirely. Without vehicle support, because the storm prevented the long-range desert group from reaching the extraction point, the team had to navigate on foot for days. Some suffered heat exhaustion. Others rationed the last sips of water as they moved through wadis and over ridges, avoiding main roads patrolled by German armored cars. Several were eventually spotted and captured by Italian forces. Others simply disappeared in the dunes, their fate recorded only as missing in desert operations. Despite the losses, Stirling viewed the mission as a proof of concept. He reported that small teams could indeed infiltrate deep inside enemy territory and inflict disproportionate damage. More importantly, Axis records, captured later in the war, confirmed that the raid destroyed multiple aircraft, a valuable blow to the Luftwaffe during the crucial early phase of Operation Crusader. Yet the human cost was sobering, and headquarters questioned the sustainability of such high-risk tactics. Stirling responded with a revised strategy. Instead of parachute insertion, he would coordinate future raids with the LRDG, using long-range vehicles to deliver and retrieve SAS patrols with greater reliability. Modern military strategists often point to these early missions when discussing the birth of unconventional warfare. The SAS faced not only the enemy but the environment, logistical limits, and the psychological strain of isolation behind hostile lines. Their success, partial as it was, proved that small, highly skilled units could achieve what larger formations could not. The mystery lies in what became of the men who never returned. Their stories remain fragmented, buried in wartime logs or remembered only in passing by those who survived. Some patrols were last seen heading into a sandstorm. Others were heard on radio sets only once before falling silent. Their lost paths form the shadowy beginning of the SAS legacy, a legacy built on courage, innovation, and unanswered questions. As 1942 approached, Stirling prepared to push the SAS even deeper into Axis-held territory, partnering with the Long-Range Desert Group for the first time, a collaboration that would lead to one of the Desert War's most overlooked and intriguing missions. In the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the North African desert, few stories are as overlooked, or as unlikely, as the origins of the Special Air Service. What began in 1941 as a bold gamble by a young and unconventional officer would soon reshape the very idea of special operations. Yet beneath the legend lies a lesser-known chapter, the earliest, most fragile missions, where success seemed improbable and failure almost guaranteed. The story opens in July 1941, when Lieutenant David Stirling, tall, irreverent, and recovering from a parachuting injury, proposed to British Middle East Command a radical idea. He wanted to create a small unit trained specifically for deep penetration sabotage raids behind Axis lines. Not large formations, not noisy frontal assaults, just stealth, explosives, and unbroken nerve. At a time when the British Eighth Army was reeling from defeats across Cyrenaica, such a unit seemed either brilliant or dangerously reckless. Stirling argued it was both, and that was precisely why it was needed. But the first challenge was not Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was the desert itself. The planned insertion for his brand new team, designated L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, required men to parachute at night onto remote landing zones. Their targets were Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica airfields stretching from Gazala to the coastal approaches near Tamat, sites defended not only by armed guards but by cruel winds and endless dunes. The terrain alone could bury vehicles, swallow tracks, and disorient even the most seasoned navigators. For the SAS, this environment would become the proving ground of their ingenuity. In November 1941, the detachment launched its first major operation to support the larger British offensive, Operation Crusader. Using flimsy maps and primitive compasses, the teams prepared to jump from RAF Wellingtons into the heart of Axis-controlled territory. One trooper later wrote in his diary, "We were entering a world without signposts, without water, without mercy. Only the stars knew the way back." But on the night of the operation, a violent storm rolled across the desert. Winds tore through the drop zones, scattering the SAS teams far from their intended landing points. Parachutes dragged men across jagged rock, smashing equipment and crippling the mission before it truly began. Nearly half the raiders never reached their designated targets, while others landed miles away in terrain mapped inaccurately at best. The storm, not the Germans, inflicted the worst losses. Still, pockets of troopers pressed ahead. Those who reached the outskirts of Axis airfields carried Lewis bombs, ingenious, lightweight charges designed by Lieutenant Jacques Lewis specifically for sabotage. They crawled across open sand under moonlight, planting explosives under Messerschmitts and Junkers aircraft aligned neatly in rows. In the distance, sentries paced, unaware that a handful of raiders threatened to cripple their entire squadron. When the bombs detonated in a chain of erupting fireballs, German ground crews scrambled to respond, too late to save the burning wings and crumpling fuselages. Yet even this partial success came with a high cost. As dawn approached, survivors of the scattered teams tried to regroup with the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, the famed navigation experts who were assigned to extract them. But the sandstorm had erased tracks and disrupted the rendezvous schedule. Several troopers wandered for hours, fighting dehydration and exhaustion. One patrol failed to reach the pickup point entirely. Axis records from nearby garrisons note finding parachutes and scorch marks on the sand but make no mention of recovered bodies. To this day, the fate of certain SAS members from that night remains uncertain, lost to the desert that has swallowed so much of history. Despite the disastrous conditions, the raid left an impression on both friend and foe. German reports listed multiple aircraft destroyed, with ground crews initially suspecting local sabotage rather than a daring Allied infiltration. Within British command circles, the partial success, achieved under horrific weather and navigational chaos, proved something more important. Stirling's concept worked. Small, mobile, determined teams could strike at the heart of the Axis war machine. The lessons of that mission would define the future of the SAS. Stirling recognized the need for vehicle-borne insertions, which would soon lead to the famous collaboration with the LRDG. He pushed for more specialized explosives, deeper reconnaissance training, and enhanced desert survival methods. Each improvement built upon the hardships of that first ill-fated jump. But there remains a lingering mystery. Wartime intelligence files from 1941 reference missing elements of the SAS team, men who never returned, whose paths vanished into the dunes. Searches conducted after the war uncovered no remains. It is possible they perished quietly in the storm. It is also possible they were captured by advancing Axis patrols whose records were later lost or destroyed. Without definitive documentation, their final hours are left to speculation. And so the SAS' earliest chapter ends not with triumph, but with a combination of daring achievement, harsh loss, and unanswered questions, setting the stage for the even more shadowed operations that followed. The next missions, conducted deeper into the Axis-held interior of Cyrenaica, would test the limits of navigation, endurance, and fate itself. In the early months of 1941, with the North African campaign locked in a deadly stalemate, a quiet but revolutionary idea emerged from the mind of a young Scots Guards officer named David Stirling. Few people today realize how fragile the concept of the Special Air Service was in its infancy. It was born not from military consensus, but from defiance, a challenge to traditional British doctrine. Stirling believed that a small, mobile force could strike deep behind enemy lines, dismantling Axis air power piece by piece. This belief, bordering on reckless ambition, would become the foundation of some of the most daring operations of the war. Yet from the beginning, the desert itself was the first and most unrelenting enemy. Temperatures soared above 45 degrees Celsius by day and plummeted at night. Vehicles broke down without warning, compasses failed near magnetic deposits, and the light of the moon could betray even the most disciplined patrol. In these conditions, Stirling assembled a unit of volunteers, not elite commandos, not experienced desert soldiers, but men willing to gamble everything on secrecy and speed. Their earliest mission briefings were little more than sketches on paper. Infiltrate, destroy, vanish. Training moved fast. Recruits from No. 8 Commando were pushed to physical limits during long-range navigation exercises, sandtable rehearsals, and nighttime demolitions practice. Stirling emphasized independence. No man was to rely solely on orders. Initiative mattered more than rank. As one early recruit recalled in a diary entry, "We were handed little more than a compassed hope and the promise that if we disappeared, nobody would know why." It was a stark reminder of the risks ahead. By late November 1941, Operation Crusader was underway, and the new SAS was ordered to conduct its first real combat test. Their target, a series of remote Luftwaffe airfields in Cyrenaica, including the heavily guarded airstrip at Gazala. The concept was simple in theory but nearly impossible in practice. Parachute in under the cover of darkness, plant explosives on enemy aircraft, and withdraw across miles of sand before dawn. Everything depended on timing, precision, and the weather. The night of the operation, however, brought a brutal twist. A sudden sandstorm enveloped the drop zones, scattering the parachutists over a vast, hostile landscape. Half the unit never reached their intended landing sites. Some were injured upon impact. Others wandered for hours in near blindness, struggling to locate their teams. The desert swallowed their footprints almost instantly. It was a harsh lesson in how quickly a plan, even one crafted with care, could be undone by the environment itself. Stirling's men pressed on. Those who managed to regroup set out across the dunes toward their assigned targets. Navigating solely by compass and the faint outline of distant ridges, they moved silently through Axis territory. But without the full strength of the team, the original objectives became impossible. After several hours of confusion and failed rendezvous, Stirling made the difficult decision to call off the operation. For a unit defined by bold ambition, the first official mission ended not in triumph, but in painful disappointment. Despite the setback, the experience forged something essential: resilience. Debriefing notes recovered from British records describe Stirling's reaction as determined, unimpressed by failure, and adamant that the method would succeed with refinement. He boldly requested additional vehicles, better coordination with existing desert reconnaissance forces, and more time to train his men in deep penetration tactics. Command hesitated, but Stirling persisted. What's often overlooked is that many of the men who participated in that first chaotic raid later became the backbone of future SAS operations, masters of desert survival. They learned the hard way how to read the shifting sands, how to move without leaving obvious tracks, and how to conserve water to the last half pint. These were lessons that manuals never taught. Lessons purchased through hardship. Modern historians often point to this failed airfield raid as proof that the SAS should never have existed at all. But hindsight ignores the reality. Innovation is rarely clean or graceful. The men of that first mission returned not broken, but sharpened. They knew now that the enemy was not only the Axis forces but the desert itself, unpredictable, unforgiving, and indifferent. As winter turned to 1942, Stirling and his volunteers retreated into the dunes to plan again. Somewhere out there, beyond the endless horizon, lay Luftwaffe outposts waiting to be struck. Axis patrols reported strange sightings of small British parties moving unusually far inland, yet no confirmed engagements could explain these encounters. Something unseen was taking shape, and in the shadows of the Libyan sands, an even more ambitious partnership was forming, one that would send the SAS farther, deeper, and more dangerously into enemy territory than ever before. It begins far from the roar of armored divisions or the thunder of aerial bombardment, out in the silence of the Libyan desert, where horizons distort in the heat and a single compass error could mean death. In the summer of 1941, few outside a narrow circle in Cairo had ever heard of the Special Air Service, a name deliberately designed as a deception. What began as a fictional airborne unit became one of the most feared raiding forces of the Second World War. Yet in its earliest days, the SAS was little more than an idea, shaped by failure, grit, and a desperate need for new tactics in the North African campaign. The struggle began with a simple problem. The British Eighth Army was losing ground against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Traditional assaults were proving costly and often ineffective against German supply chains that stretched deep into desert strongholds. Lieutenant David Stirling, a tall, unconventional Scots Guards officer recovering from a parachuting accident, realized that the desert itself could be an ally. If small teams infiltrated behind Axis lines, they could destroy aircraft, fuel reserves, and morale, all without engaging in open battle. But such a strategy required daring men willing to operate hundreds of miles from help. Training took place at Kabrit, on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Here, under suffocating heat, the first recruits, many of them commandos frustrated by cancelled missions, endured long marches, weapons drills, and constant uncertainty. The unit's first major mission, Operation Squatter in November 1941, was launched under impossible conditions. The plan called for parachuting the teams near Axis airfields around Gazala and Tmimi. A brutal, unexpected storm swept across the region the moment they jumped. Wind tore parachutes from direction, smashed men into rocks, and scattered supply canisters over miles. Of the original force, only a fraction reached their intended targets. In his diary, Sergeant Bob Bennett wrote simply, "The desert rejected us." It was a rare moment of defeat for a unit that had yet to prove itself. Out of 55 men dropped into the storm, 34 were killed, captured, or lost. The few survivors made exhausting treks to find their rendezvous point with the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, an older, seasoned reconnaissance force that would become the SAS' most essential partner. When they finally returned to Cairo, Stirling faced skepticism from every level of command. Yet instead of dissolving the fledgling unit, he argued for a new method: no more parachute drops. From now on, the SAS would enter enemy territory the way the desert nomads did, by truck, at night, guided by the stars. This shift marked the true birth of the SAS as history would remember it. With the LRDG's Ford and Chevrolet trucks leading them through uncharted dunes, Stirling's raiders practiced silent infiltration of remote Axis airfields. Their weapons were simple but effective. Lewis bombs, developed by Lieutenant Jacques Lewis, compact charges designed for low-light placement under aircraft fuel tanks. The strategy was brutally efficient: destroy the most valuable enemy assets with minimal noise, then disappear before dawn. The first successful raid came in December 1941, when an SAS team infiltrated Wadi Tamat airfield. Under the cover of blackened faces and muffled boots, they slipped past Italian sentries and placed explosives under rows of parked aircraft. Moments after they withdrew, fire blossomed across the runway. More than 20 planes were destroyed. Not a single SAS casualty. Yet even in victory, details were hazy. Italian reports listed different numbers of destroyed aircraft. German counterintelligence noted small, unknown parties operating in the desert. And RAF reconnaissance photographs failed to capture the full destruction. This ambiguity, whether caused by secrecy, confusion, or desert conditions, became a recurring theme of the SAS story. Their missions existed in the thin space between documented action and whispered rumor. For the men themselves, doubt was a constant companion. Corporal Bill Fraser later remarked, "You never knew if the desert would swallow you or save you. You just trusted your compass and your mates." Navigation relied on dead reckoning and the occasional sighting of the Southern Cross. One wrong bearing could lead teams days off course. Vehicles broke down frequently, and sandstorms could erase tracks within minutes. But the successes piled up, each raid more daring than the last, and the Axis air forces began feeling the pressure. The early SAS operations in North Africa were not the grand battles of popular memory. They were small explosions in the night, confused reports of missing aircraft, unexplained losses on Luftwaffe rosters. It was a shadow war waged by men who carried only what they needed and who rarely saw reinforcements. And it was only the beginning. As 1942 approached, Sterling planned to push the SAS deeper into Libyan territory, targeting logistics hubs instead of just airfields. But the desert had its own plans, and soon the unit would face another deadly trial, one that would leave vehicles buried, patrols missing, and historians still debating what truly happened during a sandstorm that changed everything. In the vast expanse of the North African desert, where sandstorms could swallow entire patrols and the horizon stretched into an unbroken void, a little-known truth defined the earliest days of Britain's most audacious special unit. The Special Air Service was born not out of strength, but out of desperation. In 1941, with Axis forces under Erwin Rommel pushing relentlessly toward Egypt, a small group of British commandos prepared to rewrite the rules of desert warfare. Their first missions, now quietly buried beneath more famous episodes, set the foundation for everything the SAS would eventually become. These early operations began under the leadership of a young and unconventional officer, Lieutenant David Sterling. Often described by peers as both visionary and reckless, Sterling believed that small, highly mobile teams could penetrate far behind enemy lines and cripple the Axis air presence by destroying aircraft on the ground. But the concept was untested, and the desert was unforgiving. Navigation relied on compasses that jammed with sand, sun positions often distorted by haze, and an instinct for terrain that few soldiers possessed. The struggle these men faced went far beyond their objectives. The SAS of mid-1941 was not yet the elite force the world recognizes today. It was an experiment. Their training was improvised, their equipment mismatched, and their maps sketchy at best. Sterling's men rode in modified trucks with extra fuel tanks welded on, carrying bundles of Lewis bombs, ingenious incendiary devices designed by Jacques Lewis for sabotage raids. Their first target, remote Luftwaffe airfields scattered across Cyrenaica. Each raid meant driving hundreds of miles through open desert at night, engines muffled under the roar of wind, and nerves stretched tight by the knowledge that getting lost meant death long before any German patrol appeared. Insight into these early missions comes from the diaries of troopers who noted the dual nature of the desert, its beauty and its brutality. One wrote, "The silence is complete. We move like ghosts, but the desert notices everything. Nothing here forgives a mistake." The LRDG, already experienced in desert navigation, often led the SAS to drop-off points, their drivers reading the desert floor like a map. Without the LRDG, it is likely the fledgling SAS would never have survived its first operations. The reveal of these missions comes not from British records, many of which were sparse or later overshadowed, but from fragments found in German after-action reports. Some Luftwaffe logs from late 1941 mention inexplicable losses, aircraft destroyed without warning, sentinel posts reporting shadows moving among the dunes, and tracks found leading into terrain deemed impassable. These early strikes rattled local garrisons and forced the Axis to divert resources to airfield defense. Yet the SAS remained unnamed ghosts in the sand. Modern reflections highlight why these forgotten missions matter. They shaped the tactics still used today by special operations units worldwide: stealth insertion, sabotage, exfiltration under pursuit, all pioneered under conditions few modern soldiers will ever face. The men who tested these ideas were not yet legends. They were volunteers gambling their lives on a new style of warfare. The part closes with a stark truth. Despite their initial successes, much about these early raids remains uncertain. Some patrol movements were never fully documented, and Sterling himself later admitted that the desert kept its own records. Several vehicles vanished in the deep sand seas after navigational errors or mechanical failures, never recovered despite post-war searches. Their fates linger as unsolved footnotes in an already obscure chapter of the North African campaign. As the SAS pressed farther into Axis territory, the cost of their daring would escalate, and storms, both literal and tactical, would soon push the regiment into even greater uncertainty. Beyond the next horizon awaited one of their most elusive early missions, where a single miscalculation would scatter men across the desert and leave history grasping for answers.